Welcome back to another episode of the Barron Report, where we are covering the coronavirus impact on the restaurant and hospitality space. And as we get more and more operators that are not only joining the show here, but also just the outreach that we've had over the past few weeks, some of the biggest questions that these operators are at least asking me is, hey, Paul, how do you know, or what do you know about this PPP and stimulus program, the Paycheck Protection Program? And how do you think this can apply to restaurant operations? So I said, hey, let's find out. Let's get an expert on the show. We have Joe Corrigan, General Counsel and VP of Strategic Relations with Buyer's Edge. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, Joe. So we're gonna grill you today and get some answers.
Okay.
So let's for our viewers, Buyer's Edge first, a little bit about what you guys do and how you work in the food service industry.
Sure. So we consider ourselves a pretty unique group purchasing network that we are multifaceted. We offer technology services to pretty much any food service operator that operates in the independent restaurant, multi-unit, hospitality, hotels, casinos. We offer group purchasing related services, produce management related services, supply chain consulting. We consider ourselves to be kind of the touchstone of being a resource to our food service operators because, in my opinion, there's no one built quite like us, and obviously we're biased in that view. So we are a resource to the food service industry, and we're trying to be that now, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the key here as we get more information, obviously this last Friday, the PPP program started opening up in banks. Many operators were starting to, obviously the banks themselves had struggles on getting this thing launched. But let's kind of break into what the PPP really is. I know there's a lot of regulations, but as it pertains to an operator, when you looked at this program, what were your first initial feedback elements that you kind of said, hey, wait a minute?
Yeah, great question. No, I think at first blush, the reaction that I had and my colleagues had is this is a good piece of government stimulus developed at a very quick pace and pushed out to the business network perhaps before it was fully baked. And that's equal parts a function of the climate that we're in. It's very difficult to move a lot of money into any industry from the government, especially through a loan program. And I think what we're finding ourselves in is you have an administration who desperately wants to try to help, and understanding all the pieces that go into economic stimulus and what you need to disperse loan proceeds to various industries. It's a larger task than people really realize. So while folks are somewhat critical of the fits and starts that everyone has been seeing with the banks, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little more. A large part of this is it's very difficult to mobilize stimulus this fast in response to a pandemic this big, and these are outcroppings of those factors. And I told my colleagues I would not use the word unprecedented, so I'm barred from using it on this interview.
Not a problem. All right, Joe. So some of the very specific questions that at least I've had with operators from around the country has been, hey, with this PPP program, it means that we've got to spend essentially about 75% on employment or rehire or current labor that's in our operations. For the most part, the restaurants that are essentially filing for this have either already furloughed or laid off a significant portion of their staff. Reason being is their revenues have dropped either to zero or a very highly reduced amount of revenue. So as a business owner, you look at it and say, listen, I can rehire these people, but the fact is the demand is not there because we're not released as a society. So what would those workers be doing anyway? And all it does is really kind of lend a little bit of a helping hand to the workers as a pass-through to the restaurant operator, who is then on the hook for the loan. How does that all come about?
Paul, you have just touched upon something that is, frankly, the days since the loans opened up on Friday, and the guidance has been pushed by the Small Business Administration now twice since Friday. I think the restaurant operators and the other hospitality industry operators are starting to grapple with the reality that if I take the loan proceeds and I want to get forgiveness for these loans, the current guidance I have is that I have to use 75% of the proceeds that I take to employ and bring back my staff. The
Yeah,
further guidance from the SBA is that that deadline to bring your employees back is June 30th. Well,
yeah,
as we all know, the current climate is led us to question and lead to dubious, whether these restaurants will be open in
exactly.
July and August. So it's the operators are in a very difficult position as the legislation currently stands, and that's
Uh-huh.
important for us to understand that this can be revisited. But as the legislation currently stands, operators are in a very difficult decision of whether to bring employees back, not knowing when their doors are going to open again.
Right.
The advice that I've given, and this is the advice I give to anyone that asks me the question about taking the proceeds, are don't allow forgiveness of the loan to be the tail wagging the dog. You
Hmm.
take these proceeds because your business desperately needs it to stay open. And those factors for your business are frankly unique to each one of your viewers and listeners, Paul. And
Right.
I think what I encourage them to do, especially as it relates to the restaurant industry, is to sit down with their supply chain advisors and experts and say, what is my business going to look like in the next 3 to 6 months? And that is
Yeah.
a very unique question for operators who are shaped very differently around this country. And frankly, the answer to that question is going to be different based upon the geography of this of how this pandemic spread and what areas will be hot and when.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see the analysis of where the proceeds should be used. The focus really should be for operators on where it's needed to keep the doors open.
Yeah.
Obviously, considerations are paying my landlord, keeping the lights on, helping if I have a
Right.
takeout and delivery service, supplying those services and funds for those needs. I think those are the questions that should be asked, and of course, Congress should sit down and revisit the relief and forgiveness of these loans as it relates to this industry.
Yeah, and I think and that's the thing that I'm concerned with for the restaurant industry is if you look at the unemployment number last week, we had another 6.6 million that came into the ranks of unemployment, which now nears us near 10 million unemployed this year, or excuse me, this week we could see up to around 13 to 15 million in the United States unemployed. A large percentage of that, at least from the data we pull from our own Data and Insight Center, Foodable Labs, is about 40 to 45% of that unemployment is coming from hospitality and restaurants. So if that's the case, you've got all these people unemployed, which means all these businesses essentially can't run or can't operate. You inject this PPP into the economy, and essentially you're giving kind of a false start, so to speak, because an operator essentially is going to have to use the money, if they at least want forgiveness, for something that is a productivity level that they don't necessarily need right now. Obviously, they can run their business today with about 10% of their operations because that's about what they're doing in revenue. So I guess my concern is, do you feel that operators are going to make the hard choice and say, listen, I'm just going to run the risk of this not being forgiven. I'm going to take that cash, try to make it work so that I can keep the doors open. So when this is back out there in terms of opening my restaurant, I actually can bring workers back, but that's probably going to be out and beyond June 1st. Do you think more restaurant operators will do that?
Well, I think we have to face the realities here. The realities is this is imperfect legislation, and it's the legislation we have.
Right.
So, based upon the legislation we have, operators have to ask themselves, this is a non recourse loan. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means if I'm a sole proprietor, I don't have to sign personally and put my
Mm-hmm.
personal assets at risk.
Sure.
If I'm a business that has other lenders or creditors involved, it means that I don't have to have UCC filings or liens against my business if I take the proceeds. So,
Correct.
irrespective of whether or not these loans at the end of the day are forgiven, and again, I would encourage your listeners to stay tuned because I do believe that Congress will be urged to revisit, and the SBA will be urged to revisit the forgiveness and underwriting relative to forgiveness of these loans. So
Yeah.
I suspect, and you're probably aware of this, but Congress will be sitting, I believe, at least the Senate will be sitting on Thursday for a proposed re-upping of or reauthorization and funding of that of that first 350 billion. I think currently the Mnuchin's looking for an additional 250 billion in funding. So I
Yeah.
think as it relates to the tough decision for operators, do you need the proceeds should be question one. And then question two should be, how will I use them to keep my business alive in the coming 3 to 6 months?
Hmm.
And I would say your very last question should be whether or not this loan will be forgiven.
Yeah.
Hopefully our folks in Congress will hear the concerns of the industry and answer them correctly through revised legislation.
Yeah, for sure. And I cannot express to those on Capitol Hill right now that when you are looking at revisiting this bill, you've got to take in these restaurant owners into consideration. I think in some cases they just don't necessarily understand how a restaurant operates and what's required. And I think also and I'll use the word, the unprecedented nature of shutting down an entire industry that represents 1 trillion. That's 1 trillion in revenue. Imagine the tax dollars and the tax base alone, much less the ancillary tax components that come from payroll taxes, sales and property taxes. All the things that come out of the restaurant industry are pretty, in my opinion, probably should have been looked at as, if not the number one category in the economy. To write this bill around it, I think they're going to have to come back and really kind of wrap their heads around it from that standpoint. All right, so I want to get into some other aspects of the stimulus program, and that is the EDIL, the aspect of actually going in for emergency disaster relief funding. What are your thoughts on whether or not businesses should go after that?
Well, and it's a difficult decision to make because these programs are not supposed to overlap. They're both extended by the Small Business Administration.
Yep.
What I know about the EIDL is available, and if you'll allow me a shameless plug, we put together a relief website for our operators at www.buyersedgeplatform/regulatory relief. We've made a very detailed analysis of both types of loans. As an initial matter, the PPP loans certainly seemed like the preferred vehicle for a lot of our operators because of the non-recourse, non-personal guarantee nature of these loans, and the fact that, frankly, the loan amounts were up to 10 million or 2.5 times the average monthly payroll from 2019. Mm-hmm. That had a lot of attractive aspects. I think, given the overwhelming demand for all loan proceeds right now through the SBA, I'm encouraging folks to explore multiple applications. And of course,
yeah,
if you manage to get funding under one program, you can always abandon your petition under the other. So
yep.
I'm encouraging our customers, operators, anyone in the industry who would like advice on the topic to, if you have multiple deposit accounts, submit multiple applications with multiple lenders and proceed on one petition that is granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's good. I mean, it's good to know that. I mean, as an operator, when they look at how to kind of move forward here, I think that that's going to be the big factor here. Obviously, you guys, if you're obviously watching or listening in on the show today, working with your legal counsel and your CPA are really the best steps forward in making sure you're navigating these waters at the right time in the right way for your own business. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of the other side of this, and that's because that's really kind of the big question that everybody's asking. What does the restaurant industry look like on the other side of this? You and I talked a little bit in the pre-show that supply chain could really be a big factor here. Explain why.
Sure. Well, there are multiple factors, and the reality is that given the unknowns associated with opening up a restaurant again, supply chain is always at the forefront of helping operators decide and make decisions around inventories, the amount of staff to have,
right,
the distributors to purchase from, the suppliers the distributors should be stocking from. Those are decisions that the supply chain, frankly, shapes. And understanding your critical demand from your customers, understanding which locations will have their doors open if you're a multi-unit restaurant, mm-hmm. understanding when your timing for opening is a critical decision in every decision that's made in the supply chain from there forward, because you're dealing in many instances with perishable items.
Yep.
You're dealing with rent and bringing employees back and having labor costs associated with when you do so. The supply chain is going to be a massive determining factor for which operators are well prepared and survive this, and those that come out, frankly, realizing greater levels of business because they gained in market share. I
Yeah.
think the shaping of that supply chain, I think you were alluding to that in your question. The supply chain certainly will be shaped by preferences of those going out to restaurants, whether that's the spacing of tables, whether it's the nature of tablecloths and the using of paper menus versus electronic iPad that's keyed in by the wait service. These are all determinations that will be made that in the wake of this pandemic are the types of questions that frankly may not have been asked. Well, they were asked, but I can tell you they will be asked with a greater degree of frequency than they ever were before.
Yeah,
So
for sure. I think what we've found is that there is going to be a whole new element of operational standards that are going to affect the supply chain, all the way down from business, the unit economics, because obviously if you've got let's say a 3,000 square foot restaurant and you do have to do distancing in your restaurant, both at the bar level and the table level, just the pure productivity of what your operation can handle, and obviously the output is going to change dynamics around volume, which gets you back to the unit economics of how a restaurant can live. Because most of every restaurant I know has been built on unit economics that have been crafted over the last 2 decades. It's almost as if we are setting the reset button and saying, okay, unit economics now have to be crafted thinking forward the next 5 years, as opposed to even considering what we did, 5 years ago. So I think that in itself is really going to have some interesting ripple effects in the supply chain system for sure. Is there any particular area that you think, from a supply chain standard and aspect, that would be affected most? For instance, when you look at localized, whether it's a restaurant that is an independent and they're using localized supply chain resources versus distribution supply chain resources, do you feel like we will see any kind of movement going to one or the other?
well, I think speed is going to be a determining factor. Both the ability to deliver product quickly, a high quality product, and frankly having sufficient supply of the product.
Right.
The distributors are facing all the same, and suppliers throughout the supply chain are facing all the same difficult questions of how much product to have on hand. And
Mm-hmm.
as businesses this is why, frankly, being in touch with your supply chain and being advised on how to properly ramp it up is not a one-sided conversation. That's a
Sure.
conversation that involves every member of the supply chain, including your distributor partners and your manufacturer and supplier partners. And if you're properly handling that supply chain, every stakeholder in the supply chain understands what the expectation should be and is performing at a high level. So,
Yep.
I'm not going to pick winners and losers on local versus broadline distribution. We do a fair amount of business with both at a high level. I think who responds to the new world order that we realize when we are on the other side of the pandemic is going to be a determining factor on who operators turn to. And
Interesting.
operator preferences is a big factor as well. I will say
Sure.
this: the mask industry, as operators start to ramp up again, we are already seeing an increased demand in masks, particularly cloth masks that are washable. And I
Yep.
think you're going to see linen providers and other tablecloth related providers see an uptick in demand by operators across the country. Those are
Yep.
just sort of the common sense outcroppings of trying to bring people back and help them staff in a safe environment and create a safe environment for, frankly, the guests to come back with comfort. So,
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Joe, it's been great having you on. Thanks so much for stopping in on the show today. I'm going to check back with you hopefully in the next 30, 60 days and get your opinions on how you think we're going to hopefully be on the other side now, and now we're ready to start business as usual again. So thanks for stopping in.
thank you, Paul. I appreciate you having me on, and I look forward to coming back.
All right. So all of you, as you know, this series here on the Barron Report, We are really covering in-depth topics around how your business needs to operate during this pandemic, but more importantly, how you need to come out on the other side. So we're going to continue to get experts like Joe on to talk about potential solutions. Here, you heard it right here in terms of supply chain needs to be a big part of how you're planning to move to the next level, and also just the infrastructure of how your operations are built. So make sure and stay tuned right here. If you're over on iTunes, make sure and leave us a note. If you are on Spotify, give us some love over there as well. And if you have an idea and you have an expert that you think, whether it's a CPA, a financial expert, an economic person, a infectious disease expert, ways that these experts can potentially analyze the restaurant industry and help you, send us a note, reach out to me on Twitter @Paul Barron, and of course you can always shoot us an email to producer@foodabletv.com. We will continue our coverage right here on Foodable Network. This is the Barron Report. We'll catch you next time.